So we're going to be hearing from Sophie Rowe, who is an artefacts expert for the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust.
Well, I'm very excited to be in a huge audience of people from literally everywhere. It's absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. So I'm an artefact conservator, and I've been working with UKAHT since 2016, assessing the condition of the objects that are down in the huts in the Antarctic Peninsula, and to plan for their conservation. And today I'd like to show you some of the artefacts that we work with, and how their stories can shed light on how the men lived at the British Antarctic Territories bases in the 1940s and 50s. So this is a map, a modern map of the British Antarctic Territories. I'm sure a lot of you are pretty familiar with this, but I'll just point out that we have the Antarctic Peninsula that heads out in the leftmost direction there, and you can see it says Graham Land kind of curving around, and that's the part of the Antarctic Peninsula that we're particularly focusing on. You can just see next to Graham Land also Rotherham, and that's obviously a modern British Antarctic Survey base that's operational to this day. So the history of the historic huts in the British Antarctic Territory starts with Operation Tabarin in 1943 to 46. And Operation Tabarin was significant because it was the first government-funded expedition to Antarctica. All the previous ones, Scots and Shackletons and the others that one has heard of, were actually privately funded. But this wartime expedition happened really because there was starting to be a kind of escalating tension about territorial claims in the area. So there was a background of claims from Germany, Argentina, Chile, and Britain in the Antarctic Peninsula, because it was really a very resource-rich area, and particularly of interest was whaling. Whaling produced oil, which was actually a really important food source in the early part of the 20th century. It's hard to believe it now, but that was what it was. And during the war, there were also lots of sort of unknown places where you could hide and perhaps launch sallies against convoys and so on, or hide raiders and U-boats there. So there were various things about it that made it attractive to people. And in 1941, the Germans captured 14 whaling vessels and requisitioned 23,000 tons of whale oil, which was quite a blow during wartime Britain. And in return, Britain had started introducing whaling licensing from their territories, and that made the Argentinians anxious. And so there started to be a sort of tit-for-tat placing of flags. So the Argentinians would come and place a flag and say, this area is ours. And then the Brits would come and take a flag out and say, no, it's ours. And this kind of went on in 1942 to 3. And so the Brits were very keen to establish some permanent bases in the area that would assert their claim without actually creating a direct confrontation. So Operation Tabarin was a very discreet little expedition. It was only 2 ships. It was led by this chap who you see on the top right. His name was James Marr. James Marr was actually a Boy Scout on Shackleton's last expedition, the Quest expedition of 20 to 22, which is where Shackleton famously died. And so there is a real continuity between Operation Tabarin and that heroic age of exploration, which I think is rather lovely. So Marr set out with just a small number of men, and between 1944 and 1946, they established the first permanent bases in the Antarctic Territory. That includes Port Lockroy, which became Base A, and there were also bases at Hope Bay and Deception. So in 1945, at the end of the war, the Operation Tabarin was renamed the Falklands Islands Dependencies Survey, which we all call the FIDS for short, and that was managed by the Colonial Office. And they refocused their mission to more peaceful aims, and they wanted to continue the scientific and mapping work that had happened during the heroic age and also during that early stage of exploration. And so the FIDS continued to build bases, and by 1962, there were 19 bases and 3 refuges in the British Antarctic Territory. In 1962, FIDS became the British Antarctic Survey, or BAS as we know them, and the bases actually still belong to them. And gradually, as the area was mapped, they fell into disuse and they were abandoned. Some of them were destroyed by fire, or they just collapsed. And occasionally they were used as temporary camps by visitors or researchers. And under the 1992 Antarctic Treaty Protocol, there was a real focus on keeping the Antarctic environment as pristine as possible. And that started a campaign of clearing up the bases that had sort of started to fall apart. And so in 1994, they had a conservation and significance survey of all of the remains of all of the bases that there were. And based on that, they designated 4 of them as historic sites and monuments. So that was Port Lockroy, Wordie House, Stonington and Horseshoe. And in 2009, they did, actually designated a further 2, and they were Detai and Damoy. So those are the 6 properties that are managed as historic sites, by UKAHT to this day. They've been managed by them since 1993. And so this is a map of where they are. This is possibly what Antarctica will look like when all the ice is melted, because there's no ice in this picture, it's just the mountains. But you can see these are the sites of all the different ones. I'll kind of work down from the top. So the topmost one, it's only 1 dot, but it represents 2 sites, which are Damoy and Port Lockroy, very close together. And that's probably the one that if any of you have been, you will have seen that. The next one down is Wordie House. Again, sometimes visited, but not anywhere near as often. The next one down after that is Detai, which is very remote and difficult to get to. The weather often stops people from getting to it, so very few people get to see it. The one below that is Horseshoe Island, and then the southernmost one is Stonington Island. So today I'm going to focus on the 2 huts that I know best. This is Port Lockroy. That's where I spent last winter. I spent a month there with my colleague Lizzie Meek from the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust, who've been working with UKAHT on the conservation management and planning. And we did a full artefact survey. So we looked at absolutely every object that is in that hut and did a catalogue of it and took photographs and also assessed the condition. And then the other site that I know is Horseshoe, which was base Y. This is actually a photograph from 1959. It doesn't look like that anymore. The paint is all worn off it. But Horseshoe, I did exactly the same, but on my own in 2017. So when people think about Antarctic exploration, this is the kind of thing they tend to think about. They think about, sledge journeys and dogs and camps and things like that. And certainly it's true that during the sledging season, the men from these bases spent a large amount of their time doing this. They went out and they mapped the area, traveling by dog sledge from camp to camp. And they also carried out various other scientific work at the same time. So the staff at each of the bases were all men. They were all contracted to the FIDS for 2 years each, and they'd all already done national service. And then they would each have had a specific trade or a skill to bring to the team. So there would always be a diesel mechanic and a radio operator, and then you might have a meteorologist, a geologist, or any number of other types of scientific traits to bring to things. But when you visit the huts themselves, you see a much more domestic side to the life that they led there. And I think that the room that often gets a really immediate reaction from the public when they come to visit are the kitchens. So the kitchen at Port Lockroy and at Horseshoe really gets people interested. They recognise a lot. They very often talk about, oh, my grandmother had something like this, and it really gets people engaged. So this is the kitchen at Port Lockroy. On the left, you can see a shelf of typical tinned foods that they lived on. They lived primarily on tinned and dried food. And there's quite a few brands there that people still recognise, like Marmite, you can see, and Cross and Blackwell. I think Tate and Lyle's syrup is in there. And the kitchen at Horseshoe is very similar. All of the kitchens would have had a range cooker like this one that you can see on the right. So that's a fairly standard piece of equipment in all of the FIDS huts. And this would also have had, you can see on above it, there's a great big copper tank, which is heated by the stove, and that's for hot water. It has a nice tap on the front of it as well. And this is standard equipment in all of the kitchens. So all the men would take turns, absolutely, it didn't matter whether they were the base leader or who they were, all of them equally took turns in cooking and cleaning, emptying the rubbish and dealing with the toilet. That was called gash duty, a naval term. And we're very lucky that for Horseshoe, we've actually got a diary from Derek Searle. So Derek Searle went to Horseshoe in 1955 and there wasn't a hut there at all. So he was part of the team that built the hut. And then in the second year, 1956, he became the base leader. One day when he was on cooking duty, he decided that it might be a good idea to try and make a steamed pudding. And this was a bit ambitious. And what would happen was you had to make sure that what you cooked was popular with the other guys on the team, because they weren't necessarily going to be subtle about it if they didn't like your food. But the steamed pudding went down really well. So then he was like, right, I'm going to make a jam pudding. So suddenly there's this young man making a jam pudding and it went really, really well. And then the next you hear, they're about to get their visit from the Norsal, and the Norsal was their supply ship that visited them once a year to bring them extra food and so forth. And he was worrying about the fact that he actually was so busy that he might not have enough time to make cheese straws for the guys who were going to come from the Norsal. And I found this really amusing, that a young man of 27 years old was worrying about cheese straws in 1955. But I think it actually says rather a lot about how important it was for these guys who had contracts to live in Antarctica, for 2 years, spend 2 winters in Antarctica, to actually have some things that they recognized and some of those comforts that they enjoyed. And for them in the 50s, that included cheese straws and jam puddings, apparently. So another really enjoyable thing to look at is the bookcases, because it tells you a lot about what people were interested in and what they enjoyed reading. So we got a really fascinating glimpse into this when we were looking through the bookcases in Port Lockroy. It's a very, very wide range of material. Some of it's very highbrow. There are 14 volumes of Proust at Port Lockroy. I think it's quite interesting they were left behind, actually. Maybe I shouldn't comment on that. And then there are lots of paperback mysteries and cowboy novels and that kind of thing. And there's also an awful lot of magazines, and there are the kind of titles you'd expect, like Punch and John Bull magazine. There are sport titles and motoring titles, but there are also an enormous number of women's magazines. So there is Women's Own, Woman's Realm, Woman's Weekly, Woman's Illustrated, and Woman. So we were a bit mystified as to why these should have been so popular on an all-male base. And then we actually discovered the answer, and it is on the left-hand side. You can see this is the Dance Beauty number of Woman, which was from October the 4th, 1958. And one of the guys at Danko Island, which was base O, had written in, and his letter was published, and it said, amongst a batch of magazines that arrived here in the Antarctic recently were copies of your magazine. When I first saw these, I thought how incongruous that they should be sent to what is strictly a man's world. This is a small base with 5 members who have to do all their own housework and cooking, besides specifically scientific work. As reading material is always short and the infrequent arrival of mail always eagerly awaited, every scrap of literature is read avidly. Shortly after your magazines arrived, one could have seen rugged, bearded explorer types poring over your beauty hints and carefully studying the recipes. We thought you might like to know that your weekly was read with interest down at the bottom of the world. So in 1957, Prince Philip actually came and visited 7 of the FIDS bases on the Antarctic Peninsula. And he wrote, I was most impressed by the obvious good spirit at the bases and also by the very high standard of housekeeping. So clearly all this time reading the women's weeklies was standing in good stead. So I have to say, I think the housekeeping, there's a slightly more serious point to this. It's a really important part of the ethos of the FIDS era. Because although there were the very peaceful scientific objectives, fundamentally the British permanent bases were about sovereignty. And it wasn't enough for the men just to live in Antarctica. They needed to live in a civilized way. They should be eating proper meals, keeping clean and dressing properly, and running an official government office, in other words, a post office, at all of the bases. And there were signed photos of the Queen, and Prince Philip at every base, just to remind people of their patriotic duty. So the emphasis on maintaining standards explains this object at Horseshoe, which I was very surprised to see, the one on the left there. I'm just about old enough, actually, that I had something not that different from this in one of my student accommodations. It's an electric washing machine. It's probably actually easier just to wash things by hand, to be honest. But this was electric, you could plug it in. And in fact, all the huts were fully electrified. They had diesel motors or generators, 1 or more of them, and electric light, and it ran all the lots of meteorological equipment and so on. So they were able to run this thing. And there are also 2 mangles. So one of my favorite items is also the bathtub, which is at Horseshoe. This is a homemade bathtub. It's actually made from 2 oil drums that have been welded together. And it vents straight outside. So on the left-hand side, you can see a sort of slightly greenish thing and a piece of string coming down. That's actually the plug, and I've given you a close-up of it. It's made from a rather beautiful nut that's been welded into a hole. And then the plug is made of wood with a little piece of metal on it, and it's attached with a piece of string. And that vents through a pipe straight out of the wall of the building and outside. So if you let the water out and then went out and it was a cold day, you might find yourself just going flying on an ice skating rink. It was a bit of a case of don't walk around that side of the building when someone's just had a bath. But before this was put in 1956, but before that, Derek Searle recorded in his diary that the men used to wash in a sort of small tub of water, which would get cold so incredibly quickly that they had to be revived by whiskey and lime after taking a bath. So you can imagine that this would have felt like great luxury, because as you can see, it's got a tap, and that tap is connected to another one of those enormous copper tanks, and with water that's heated from a different stove, from the one in the lounge this time. So you can just imagine them really sort of having a nice hot soak. And that seems to be the reason why somebody has put a cartoon of happy pigs on the wall immediately above the bath, and that's what the other part of the picture is. But I think the most surprising thing that I found in Antarctica at all, anywhere, was these peculiar items. This is a very strange, scruffy-looking photograph. These are scattered all over the floor in the attic at Horseshoe Island, and you can see there's some packing straw, and then you can see some sort of brown lumps that look like dead tea bags there. But what they actually are is seed potatoes. So there were several experiments in gardening in the Antarctic Peninsula during the FIDS era, because actually when you look at it, the latitude of those huts is roughly the same as Reykjavik. So in principle, you would think you should be able to grow things there. And so the botanist Ivan Mackenzie Lamb, who was one of the original Operation Tabarin team, actually tried to establish a garden at Port Lockroy in 1945. And he imported a lot of soil from the Falkland Islands and also lots of seeds and things and tried to plant them. But unfortunately, what it turned out was the climate was incredibly dry, and short of watering it constantly, which they couldn't really keep up with, everything just died, and then the soil all blew away because there were no roots to hold it there. So when you go now, you can't see any traces of this thing. But they obviously also looked into trying to have plants in pots, and they did have some success with that. So this is a photograph of Derek Searle. We've been hearing a bit from his diary. This is him cutting lettuces in Austria. I really like this photograph. I think it's rather beautiful. So they must have been a very welcome addition to the diet, because mostly they were eating the dried and tinned food that we saw earlier. And of course, at Port Lockroy this year, we found an invoice from Sutton Seeds, still a company that you might have bought seeds from yourselves. And they were buying cress, lettuce, mustard, radishes, and spring onions, all of which you can grow very happily in a pot. But I'm interested that they also were growing daffodils, snowdrops, hyacinths, and crocuses. And then we found in the archive, there's a photograph of them very successfully having got the daffodils to flower. They planted them in these enameled, I don't know what they are. I think they're either baking trays or they might be photographic developer trays. So on the right-hand side, we actually found one of those trays in the dark room. And we know it's one of those because it's got a very specifically drilled hole in one corner, which they would have done in order to get the drainage. And I suppose it's hard to see why you would bother planting bulbs, because you can't eat them, other than exactly the same reason we plant them today, which is to cheer yourself up in the spring after a long, hard winter. So radio communications were incredibly important at the bases, particularly through Port Stanley. And so there's a dedicated radio room both at Port Lockroy and at Horseshoe. The radio operator would send lots and lots of scientific results, particularly meteorological results, through and kept in touch with the FIDS commanders as well. But he would also send messages to people's loved ones. And what would happen would be men would write out what they wanted to have sent, and then that would be radioed through by the radio operator. There's an example on the left here. It says, the sun should be back in another month. A dog who escaped during the evacuation of W, that's base W, arrived here last week looking very fat and pleased with himself. Regards to Uncle, love Malcolm. And that was sent, according to this, via the Z8 radio on the 27th of June, 1959. So we found quite a few bundles of these at Horseshoe. There are probably about 100 messages or 200 messages or so at Horseshoe. But at Port Lockroy, there are over 3,000 of these. And I think it would be a fantastic project to digitize them, actually. Paper material in the Antarctic, and we'll hear more about this, I think, from the others, is it's quite a vulnerable material and they won't do brilliantly forever. So to capture that information, preserve it and make it accessible to other people, it would be fantastic to digitize it. And then we could add it to the rest of that enriching knowledge that we have about the objects in these huts. So we've talked about baking and we talked about bulbs, but what about the Beastie? Well, this is the Beastie. I think I've mentioned that the FIDS were doing lots of scientific work, including geology, botany and zoology when they had the chance. But Port Lockroy was not a sledging base. And so the main piece of scientific work that they were doing was Ionospherics, which is the study of the ionosphere. So the hut at Port Lockroy has a dedicated lab for ionospherics. And it had a state-of-the-art Union Radio Mark II ionosonde, and this is what you can see on the left-hand side there. It was wired into the ceiling, and then above that, on the roof, was an aerial. And the way it worked, and in 1982, I'll tell you how it was described. Alan Roger described it as an ungainly, slightly untidy collection of thousands of resistors, hundreds of capacitors, tens of thermionic valves, relays and switches, and 3 bicycle chains. And there really are 3 bicycle chains in it. But it was actually a state-of-the-art piece of equipment because it allowed you to do automated sending of radio signals into the atmosphere on a frequent basis. And so every 15 minutes, it would send out 4 minutes worth of radio waves into the ionosphere. So the ionosphere is basically the area of the atmosphere that's between 70 and 700 kilometers above the Earth. And this works in a rather similar way to sonar. So where sonar, you send sound waves down through the sea, and then you can use that reflection time it takes for them to bounce back up to the ship to tell you how deep the water is at any given point. This works in a very similar principle where you send radio waves up into the atmosphere and then record how long it takes them to get back. And on that basis, you can characterize different layers in the ionosphere, which is characterized by lots of gases that have been partially ionized by solar radiation. And the reason why the ionosphere was interesting to people is because you can use it to amplify long-range radio communications. So in the days before satellites and all the things that we rely on now completely, you could send very long-range radio messages using the ionosphere, and sending that data out. The data was collected every month and sent to 70 different radio research stations around the world. And that was done continuously for a 30-year period from Antarctica. So it was pretty significant stuff at the time. But the reason it was called the Beastie was because it was firing off every 15 minutes for 4 minutes at a time. And while it was doing that, no other radio signals could get through. You couldn't send or receive messages through the radio room. But also, if you were trying to listen to the World Service and you had a play on, or you wanted to know the scores, you know, West Bromwich Albion versus whoever, you weren't going to get any of that. It wasn't going to happen. And so it was called the Beastie because of that. And the people who operated were known as the Beastie Men. So the first Beastie came to Port Lockroy in 1953. And then when Port Lockroy was decommissioned as a base in 1962, the Ionosonde was sent to Halley Bay, which is now famous as the one that every now and again gets closed. But the original Halley bases were actually on top of the glacier, and then they got snowed up very quickly and ended up under the ice. And so that machine eventually got crushed by ice and was lost. So the current machine that you see at Port Lockroy was actually discovered by Alan Carroll, who had been a Beastie man himself. And I think he located it, Camilla might know the answer to this, but I think it was in a field in Lincolnshire or somewhere. And he found it, brought it, nursed it back to health and so forth, and restored it. And he installed it here at Port Lockroy, say here, not there, what am I saying? At Port Lockroy, but with Perspex panels on the side, so you can see how it's supposed to work. But the picture on the right-hand side shows the same machine at the Argentine Islands that was still working in 1975. And in fact, it had metal panels, and they would quite often be decorated by the Beastie Men. So I'm hoping that this sort of whistle-top tour of artifacts at the UKAHT sites has given you a bit of a taste of how the objects can really bring the stories of these people to life, and give you a real sense of the atmosphere of the FIDS era. We're incredibly fortunate that we have diaries and base reports, radio messages, accounts and invoices, and all of those things, many of them held in the archives at BAS. And all of these add depth to our understanding and knowledge of this era. And we've also been incredibly lucky to be able to talk directly to some of the former FIDS staff about things that we find at the sites and be able to learn from what they tell us. So I'm someone who's worked a lot on objects that are much, much older than this, and particularly Egyptian material, for example, ancient Egyptian material. And I can tell you now, it's a really rare privilege to be able to talk to people who were using the objects that you're working on. And we certainly should make the most of that opportunity. So it's appropriate for me, I think, to finish off with this, which is one of my favourite pictures from the FIDS era. It was sent by Jim Franks, who worked at Horseshoe between 1958 and 59. He sent it to UKAHT just after we'd finished our field season there at Horseshoe. And it shows Jim himself relaxing. He's got the best bunk in the house and a nice bowl of tulips next to him. And it's a lovely sunny day, relaxing away. So I'd just like to say thank you. There are enormous numbers of people who support the work that we do. And yeah, none of it could happen without them. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk. Wonderful.